Hello, so this is a history video, but I think it can also be a video about truth and about the need for transparency in the world's most populous country. I watched a lecture recently on YouTube by the renowned sinologist Frank Dikotter. This lecture was at Cambridge. I don't know if that was Cambridge, England, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. But anyway, it was a lecture on his latest book at that time, Mao's Great Famine: The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe. Um, it was a bestseller, and it's one of only a very small scattering of books that have actually been made that is to be widely publicized on the horrors of Mao's policy. So just a brief introduction to Frank Dikotter before I continue. I'd been familiar with the guy, I'd known his name, but I hadn't looked at his work in depth. I haven't got any of his books. I have Yang Chicheng's Tombstone, which is also about the Great Chinese Famine. I have Yung Chang and John Holliday's Mile the Unknown Story and Yung Chang's Wild Swans, all of which are banned in China. So this is an introduction to Frank Dikotter. Frank Dikotter is the author of the People's Trilogy, a series of books. Just getting the lost a little space here. There we go. A series of books that document the impact of communism on the lives of ordinary people in China on the basis of new archival material. The first volume, entitled Mao's Great Famine: The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction. Um, Britain's most prestigious book award for non-fiction. The second installment, The Tragedy of Liberation: A History of the Chinese Revolution 1945 to 57, was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2014. The Cultural Revolution: A People's History 1962 to 1976 concludes the trilogy and was shortlisted for the PEN Hessel Tiltman Prize in 2017. Frank has been Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong since 2006. Before coming to Hong Kong, he was Professor at the Modern History of China at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He was born in the Netherlands in 1961, educated in Switzerland, and graduated from the University of Geneva with a double major in history and Russian. After 2 years in the People's Republic of China, he moved to London, where he obtained his PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies. In 1990, he stayed at SOAS as British Academy postdoctoral fellow and as Wellcome Research Fellow before being promoted to personal chair as professor of the Modern History of China in 2002. I'll leave it there because there's a lot more biographical information. I want to get to this talk, and particularly the event in question, um, which is Mao's Great Famine. Now, I'm probably more familiar with the Cultural Revolution because I think, in some ways, the horrors of the Cultural Revolution are um, a bit more stark, if I could put it that way, because we know of the Cultural Revolution as the struggle sessions, as fanatical Red Guards, shaming their own parents, beating teachers to death. It was a nightmarish time, the 1960s in China. The peak of the Cultural Revolution was probably around 67, 68, but it went on right into 1976, right up to Mao's death. So the Cultural Revolution has had some references in film. There was a brief scene in The Last Emperor. There was, I've mentioned the film To Live, which focused on the Cultural Revolution in significant detail, but that film was censored for many years here. Um, no communist atrocity, none of the horrors of Mao's era are given anywhere near enough attention either in China or the West. And this comes back to the video I made on why is it that communism doesn't get the same stigma as fascism. If we consider fascism, it rightly gets attention. There are memorials to the Holocaust, there are museums, there are many films, as there should be, and I'm pleased there is because people must never ever forget the sheer evil of the Third Reich and Nazism. It was one of the most evil plagues to ever infest humanity. But the Great Leap Forward, the policy that led to China's Great Famine, was also one of the most devastating, um, darkest episodes, not just of the 20th century, I would argue, of human history. Um, I mean, the scale of this was absolutely massive. Now, Frank Dikotter quotes a higher end of things. His figures are on the higher scale of things. Others, Yang Chicheng, who wrote Tombstone, also about the Great Chinese Famine, suggested a figure of 36 million people perished, which is still a staggeringly high figure. Staggering. I mean, those sort of numbers are hard to even comprehend. Consider that you are in a sizable town in the UK of a population of say 100,000. Now let's consider a sizable city, Birmingham, 1 million people. Multiply that times 36. That is the sort of number that we're talking about. Even if those both figures are wrong, and I suggest they may actually be conservative figures because the full archives have not been released. But even if you go for the lower end of things, even if you play the devil's advocate and go with the official figure from the Chinese government, which is 15 million, 15 million people, 15 million people, I would make reference to something that was quoted in the Holodomor, which was Ukraine's genocide, um, or the forced famine, I should say, by Stalin in Ukraine, which arguably was a genocide. Anywhere from 7 to 12 million died in that catastrophe. And there is a quotation, it wasn't a case that 7 million people died, it was a case that a person died 7 million times in a way that is far more stark. So, anyway, what Frank Dikotter spoke about in this lecture on the Great Chinese Famine was specifically about the violence around it. And this is an aspect that I hadn't really realized. I had always associated the violence in communist China with the Cultural Revolution, and no doubt there was a lot of violence in the Cultural Revolution. There was struggle sessions, there was mass murder, there was forced suicide. Um, but I had always sort of thought that the Great Famine, horrendous as it was a case of a famine. People starved to death. But there was a lot more to it than that. There was extreme violence around this. And it came from the collectivization of the Great Leap Forward and this mass drive for industrialization, for steel production. China, of course, when the communists took over in 1949, was a very poor country. So one could argue that there was a necessity to modernize, to industrialize the country. But the way this was done through collectivization was an utter disaster because it turned people, human beings, into mere numbers. And there was a multiple range of reasons why this famine occurred. By almost every measure, it was the single worst famine in human history. And aside from the Black Death and perhaps the Spanish flu, this was the single worst non war disaster in human history. I really don't think we could put too fine a point on that because the sheer numbers that we're talking about are frightening. So Frank Dikotter comes up with a figure of 45 million. I'll get to the violence aspect in a minute, but it comes up with a figure of 45 million. How does he reach this? Well, leading up to the 2008 Olympics, there was a brief period of openness, which I wasn't really familiar with, but I remember that time the Chinese government was working very hard under the Hu Jintao administration to deflect criticism. So they did have a slight opening up period of archives, presumably in Beijing. He took advantage of this as an academic to do extensive research, and he got as much information as he possibly could, and he researched this over a period of 4 years. But even Frank Dikotter himself has said that his title may not be that accurate, The Great Famine, because that denotes simply people starving to death. What he argues is actually this was a period of mass political turmoil and mass repression, which is really what it was. And he makes the point, if you take Pol Pot's Cambodia, look at the film The Killing Fields. documents the horrors of Pol Pot's Cambodia. Around 2 million people died in that genocide, and the world was rightly shocked. And in recent years, Khmer Rouge leaders have been put on trial. There's never, ever been any prosecution for senior members of the Communist Party. Well, there was Gang of Four. Mao never faced justice, and the party to this day is not honest about it. So I think the situation of China is almost exceptional as totalitarian regimes go. Even Russia has been somewhat more honest about Stalin. That's saying something. Um, like I say, there was a time about, I think it was about 10 years ago, Dmitry Medvedev actually visited a monument, a memorial to the Holodomor in Ukraine. Now, Russia still hasn't fully acknowledged Stalin's genocidal role in that, but the State Duma did acknowledge that Stalin was responsible. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has always used scapegoats instead of blaming Mao directly, or at most, they say he made a few mistakes. But there's a real, before I get to Frank Dikotter's lecture, there's a real contradiction in that. You cannot say the great helmsman was the wise leader of China who brought the country into the modern world. He had absolute power, he was an absolute dictator, he had an iron grip on the country. So are we really to believe that he was foolishly misled by a few people and he had no idea what was going on? I think that is staggeringly dishonest and disingenuous. And I think, quite simply, the reason the CCP aren't honest about it is because Mao was a communist. He came from the party. He may have tried to turn the party upside down, but he's sort of like their embarrassing uncle that they want to keep revering because he's kind of the bedrock of communist ideology. And yet they know, I think they know full well that Mao was a disaster. Deng Xiaoping done a lot more for China than Mao did, and that's not to exonerate Deng Xiaoping of his excesses. Tiananmen Square. So this lecture, it's only about half an hour long. Dakota really gets into some very fascinating but also horrifying information. There were cases of children being left to die by their own parents because their parents would take their clothes and try to sell them. There were cases of people being tortured to death in the most gruesome ways you can imagine because they were accused of taking extra food. So, with this collectivization process, party cadres, party chiefs were put in charge of these little communes, uh, thousands of them across the country, in every province. Now, some provinces were a lot harder hit than others. I think I may be wrong about this, but I think the hardest hit provinces were Henan province, Sichuan province, Gansu province. They were really, really devastated. In Sichuan alone, possibly as many as 10 million people died in one province. One province. So you can imagine if Dakota's come up with a figure of 45 million. So if 10 million people died in Sichuan, that would be a quarter of the total, almost a quarter of the total. So it's very plausible that the figure was a lot higher. In fact, Yang Zhicheng puts a direct toll of 36 million, but he includes 40 million births that did not occur, i.e., women who suffered miscarriages as a result of extreme starvation. Therefore, the total figure could have been as high as 76 million excess deaths in China, or let's say lives being lost in China at that time. Whatever way you look at it, even if you look at the lower figures, these are staggeringly high figures. Staggering. And I really don't think that can be emphasized enough. Um, Dakota mentions that it's been estimated that 4 to 5% of all deaths in the Great Leap Forward and the Great Chinese Famine that came about from it were violent. 4 to 5%. Now, if 45 million people died, that means somewhere around 2 to 4 million people were violently killed in China in the years 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961, or he extends it to 1962. In Chinese oral history, that's seen as the three bitter years. 50, I think they call it 59, 60, 61, the three bitter years, or the 3 years of natural disasters. The Great Chinese Famine, as it's known around the world. Um, the violence was extreme. because basically people were utilized as objects, as tools. So if they were too weak to work in fields, they would not get access to the canteens. They would simply die. If party cadres were seen as too lenient, they would be killed. This was a period of mass chaos that would only be repeated in the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was supposed to be the response to the failure of the Great Leap Forward. It was a massive embarrassment for Mao. It was his decision. And yet, what happened after the Great Leap Forward? Was Mao forced from power? No, he got even more powerful. This is what's terrifying about the modern history of China, that in almost any other example in the world where you have totalitarianism, at some point the dictator would collapse. Mao clung on and clung on and clung on. I'm going to put a link to the video. Frank Dikotter is a lot more eloquent than I am in terms of detailing this. But it is an aspect, I must say, that surprised me. I'd always assumed, okay, people died. It was horrible, but a lot of people died. When you consider that a lot of them died violently, for what? For the crime of wanting to eat? For the most basic human necessity? There were cases of people eating mud because they were so desperate. Cases of people eating tree bark. And what coverage is there of this, really? There's a scattering of books. I'm very pleased that Dakota's book has been widely publicized, and so has Yang Jicheng's. But we're talking about a few successful books. There are some documentaries on YouTube. China Forbidden News and other sources document interviews with survivors of the Great Leap Forward. Um, what's interesting is that Dakota has said that for every death threat he gets, because communists can't handle criticism, he actually gets about 10 supportive messages from people in the mainland saying that they do actually want to talk about this. Bear in mind, this is not ancient history. We're only talking less than 60 years ago. I mean, these are things that people need to know about. As it stands, there is no way the Communist Party is going to be more open. There's no Olympic Games coming up, so there's no need to. Their only interest is clinging on to power. Dishonesty lies at the heart of communist totalitarianism. And it's a cruel joke when they talk about liberating China, when they have single-handedly been more responsible for more Chinese deaths than the evil Japanese or the wicked European colonialists. And I think it is possibly the biggest mass deception in human history that the Chinese Communist Party has led the Chinese people to believe that it was simply a few mistakes, that this was not a deliberate attempt to push forward Mao's policies, regardless of the costs. That's the reality of this. The idea that Mao didn't know what was going on and he'd done absolutely nothing to stop this. I mean, party bosses in every province, every county, were making reports about what was happening. Mao knew. This went all the way to the top. Because Mao had absolute power, it had to go to the top. So I think it is an utter tragedy that this is really not, that there's this mass whitewashing in China. I do hope that one day Frank Dakotter's book, Yang Jicheng's book, and Jun Chang's book are available on the mainland. I know he's had an edition published in Mandarin. People have a right to know their past, and I hope, beyond hope, that one day there will be a memorial to the victims of this atrocity. I hope there will be acknowledgement of just how horrendous this was. I want to see museums. I want to see films, because otherwise we have the ghosts of 45 million people forever trapped in a limbo. I mean, not to get religious on it, but it's it's just horrendous that in the year 2019 there's still so many lies in this country. There's so much dishonesty, and the Chinese government's too busy pointing fingers at the West to look in the mirror, and it makes me very angry. But clearly, there will be millions of people in this country who directly experience it, who survived it, and they know. But because this is a totalitarian state, they can't make petitions and demand memorials. And It's just too difficult at this point. So I think the only way this is going to happen is for some sort of reform within the party. It's not going to happen under Xi Jinping. It may happen several decades from now. I don't know. But I think this should be recorded as the biggest deception in history, that all the policy disasters of Mao have been downplayed as mere mistakes. These were not mistakes. Mao knew what he was doing. Mao knew the chaos. Mao deliberately instilled the chaos. And it is about time this evil man was recognized for what he was. I think China will truly move forward when his face is no longer on the RMB note. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So I'll put a link to the video, and I just hope that one day there is more honesty about this. I give a lot of credit to Frank Dikotter and others who have shown courage, actually. It does take courage to write against the Chinese Communist Party, because not only are you going against a totalitarian regime, you risk the backlash from nationalistic young Chinese, especially young Chinese, who have been taken in by the communist education system, and they think that any criticism of the party, Chinese who do it are traitors, foreigners who do it are CIA agents. That's how they dismiss it. So it's really tragic. But anyway, I'm not going to overthink this. It's too damn depressing. Very interesting, but also depressing. You know, this is a huge body of work that Frank Dikotter has come out with. If the Communist Party want to say it's all lies, it's not true, they have a simple choice: be more open. If they're really innocent, then what do they have to fear? That's a simple question.